Imagine a world without the steady hum of refrigerators, without the metallic gleam of stoves, without the clatter of modern cookware. Imagine instead the deep quiet of a village night in the Middle Ages, where the only light came from stars above and from the small flickering glow of a hearth fire. In this world, food was not prepared with gadgets or machines, but with instinct, patience, and the simplest of tools. The kitchen, if it could even be called that, was not a room filled with drawers and polished counters, but a smoky space, often little more than the central corner of a one-room hut. Here, the fire was everything: warmth, light, and the only possible way to cook. Picture a peasant family at the end of a long day. Their home is small, with low wooden beams and walls of wattle and daub, patched and weathered by years of wind and rain. In the center, a fire smoulders, its smoke curling upward through a hole in the roof. Around it, the family gathers. There is no dining table covered in plates, no gleaming silver cutlery, no neat arrangement of dishes. Instead, there is a pot, an iron cauldron, if they are fortunate, or perhaps a heavy clay vessel, blackened by soot. It hangs on a simple hook above the fire, suspended in the heat. This vessel is their kitchen, their pantry, their tool chest, all in one. Whatever nourishment they have managed to gather, it will end up here, simmering slowly as the flames lick the base. The fire is not just a practical necessity, it is the heart of life. It is tended carefully, often never allowed to die. To lose the fire is to lose the ability to cook, to preserve, to survive. Starting a blaze anew is no simple matter in a world without matches, without flint and steel in every home. Families kept embers glowing day and night, burying them under ashes to keep them alive. The fire was like a member of the household, requiring constant care. When a child stirred in the night, they would see the faint glow of red coals, hear the occasional crack of wood, and smell the earthy smoke that clung to every wall, every garment, every breath of the house. Cooking in such a setting was as much about imagination as it was about resources. The poor often owned only one pot. In it they cooked everything: grains, vegetables, scraps of meat, herbs, or, more often than not, whatever could be gathered from the fields and forests. The pot might hold a stew that had been simmering for days, with ingredients added when available, and ladled out as needed. It was not a recipe in the sense we know today, but a living dish, evolving with time, shaped by circumstance. Each family had their own rhythm, their own flavor, their own way of coaxing nourishment from the limited ingredients their world allowed. Close your eyes and imagine the scene more fully. The smell of smoke hangs heavy in the air, mixed with the faint aroma of onions and barley cooking slowly. Children crouch near the fire, hungry eyes watching the bubbling pot, waiting for the moment when it will be ladled out into rough wooden bowls. The mother stirs with a long spoon carved from wood, her hands calloused from work in the fields and chores at the hearth. The father breaks off a piece of coarse rye bread, hard from yesterday's baking, and softens it by dipping it into the broth. There are no forks, no knives for each diner, only shared spoons, shared bowls, and bread used as a utensil. Eating is simple, direct, communal. The scene may sound modest, even bleak, but in truth there was something deeply human in this closeness. The hearth was more than a place of cooking, it was the anchor of the home. In the dark winters, families huddled around it for warmth. In the uncertain seasons of hunger, it was where they prayed that the little food they had might stretch further. The fire was where stories were told, where children learned traditions, where generations found continuity. For all its smoke and soot, for all its discomfort, it was also a place of comfort. Contrast this to our modern kitchens, gleaming with technology. We flick a switch, and flames appear instantly, clean and controllable. We open a fridge and find abundance waiting. In the medieval world, every flame was fragile, every meal uncertain. Tools were so scarce that what little existed became precious. A pot might be patched and repatched, until it was more repair than original metal. A wooden spoon might be handed down through generations. A single knife might serve an entire household, cutting bread, carving meat, slicing roots. The simplicity was not chosen, it was enforced by scarcity. Yet in that scarcity, people forged a remarkable intimacy with their food, and with the fire that transformed it. Think for a moment of the silence of those nights. Beyond the crackle of wood, there is little sound. The village outside is still, save perhaps for the distant bark of a dog, or the muffled ringing of a church bell. In the hut, shadows move along the walls as the flames flicker, the pot simmers. The smell of broth fills the air. This is not merely cooking, it is survival, ritual, and a thread of continuity stretching back through countless generations. Each family, each village, each culture, all bound together by the shared necessity of fire and the humble act of transforming raw ingredients into something edible. The image of a medieval kitchen is often romanticized, yet it was a place of constant labor. Firewood had to be gathered, often in large quantities, for a single day's cooking could consume more than a family might imagine. Smoke irritated the eyes, clung to clothing, and blackened ceilings. Pots were heavy, easily broken if made of clay, and costly to replace if made of iron. Food burned easily without careful attention, yet despite these challenges, meals were made, life endured. Families gathered in the glow of the hearth, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The hearth, in all its simplicity, was more than a tool for cooking. It was a symbol of the medieval struggle and spirit. Around it people faced hunger, found warmth, and created what little joy they could. Around it they shared food, stories, and laughter. Around it they survived. And so when we speak of cooking in the Middle Ages, when we imagine how people prepared their meals with almost no tools, we must begin here, with the fire in the darkness, the heart of the medieval home. If the fire was the heart of the medieval kitchen, then the tools around it were the bones and sinew. Yet, unlike the gleaming, abundant instruments of a modern kitchen, the tools of the Middle Ages were sparse, heavy, and often improvised. What they had was simple, and what they did not have was immense. To understand how people cooked with almost nothing, we must first explore both the few items that made meals possible and the many we take for granted that simply did not exist. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping into a humble medieval home. You would not find shelves lined with pans of every size, nor rows of utensils designed for precise tasks. You would not see rolling pins, blenders, measuring cups, or neat knives placed in blocks. Instead, you might find a single pot, iron if the family was fortunate, clay if not. That pot was often the most valuable item in the household, second only to livestock. Without it, there was no way to boil, to stew, or to prepare the grains and vegetables that made up the foundation of survival. For those who could not afford even a pot, cooking was done on hot stones, with food roasted or baked directly in the ashes. Beside the pot, there might be a single knife, sharpened again and again until its blade was thin and worn. This knife was not just for cooking. It cut rope, shaped wood, butchered animals, and sliced bread. Spoons were carved from wood, often by the families themselves, each one shaped by hand and unique. Bowls were also wooden or clay, fragile and few. Forks, as we know them, were rare in most of medieval Europe until much later, and most meals were eaten with fingers, spoons and bread as makeshift scoops. Plates, too, were not the smooth ceramic circles we know today. For peasants, a plate might simply be a flat piece of wood or a large slice of stale bread, known as a trencher, which absorbed juices and was sometimes eaten afterward. Now consider the absence: no frying pans with flat metal surfaces, no whisks, no colanders, no glass jars or bottles, no cast iron skillets, no metal cutlery for each diner. The scarcity of iron meant that even small items were treasured. A pot could cost the equivalent of months of a laborer's wages, and repairing a broken pot was more likely than replacing it. Clay vessels were more common, but they were brittle and prone to cracking under the strain of daily use. A dropped pot was a disaster, sometimes forcing a family to borrow, barter, or go without. Even in better-off households, the list of tools would seem bare to modern eyes. In a merchant's home, you might find multiple pots, perhaps a mortar and pestle for grinding herbs, a ladle made of iron, or a small spit for roasting meat. In a nobleman's castle, tools became symbols of wealth. There one could see long spits for turning whole animals over fires, specialized knives for carving, large cauldrons, and even early ovens built of brick. But these luxuries were far removed from the daily experience of the majority, who lived with the most basic implements imaginable. The difference between what peasants had and what nobles had was not merely a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. Imagine a noble feast, dozens of servants working with iron pots, spits, ladles and knives, preparing roasted boar, spiced stews and sweet pastries. Now contrast that with the peasant family, who shared a single spoon, passing it hand to hand as they ate from a communal pot. Tools amplified the abundance of the wealthy, while exposing the vulnerability of the poor. But there is another layer to this contrast: the absence of what we think of as standard kitchen infrastructure. No ovens in most peasant homes, no chimneys in many of them, and often no separate kitchen space at all. Smoke filled the room as food cooked, coating ceilings with soot, and filling lungs with irritation. Cooking was not a neat, contained process. It was a constant negotiation with discomfort. In noble households, the kitchen was often placed in separate buildings or wings of castles to avoid fire hazards, and large hearths allowed for multiple dishes to be prepared at once. Tools in such places multiplied, becoming instruments of both culinary creativity and display of status. And yet, despite the lack of tools, meals were made. Grain was ground not in flour mills owned by peasants, but at the Lord's mill, where families had to pay fees or surrender part of their harvest. Lacking proper utensils, people devised ways to stretch what they had. Bread doubled as plate and spoon. Knives passed from hand to hand at meals. Cauldrons never truly emptied, but were constantly replenished with what little was available. This economy of tools bred creativity, but it also bred constant fragility. Consider the daily act of cutting vegetables. Today we take for granted a sharp, well-balanced knife designed for the task. In the Middle Ages, a single dull blade might serve for everything. Imagine trying to carve a tough root vegetable with a knife that had already butchered a pig and split wood that morning. The effort required was immense, and yet this was life, imperfect, difficult, but unyielding. The scarcity of tools also created a communal dependence. Villages often had shared ovens, where bread was baked in large batches, as few families could afford their own. Blacksmiths and potters provided tools when possible, but their wares were costly, and repairs were more common than replacements. The rhythm of a community was tied to the rhythm of its tools, and those tools were always in short supply. So when we think of medieval cooking, we must set aside the modern picture of drawers full of instruments and cupboards full of gadgets. Instead, imagine cooking as an act of resilience, performed with the bare minimum: a pot, a knife, a spoon, a fire, that was enough to sustain life. And in the rare households where more could be found, those tools became treasures, not just objects of utility, but markers of wealth and stability. What they had was little, what they didn't have was everything we now assume is essential. But in that narrow space between scarcity and survival, they created a cuisine of necessity, simple but enduring. The absence of tools did not stop them, it shaped them, and in that shaping lies the story of medieval cooking itself. If tools were scarce in the Middle Ages, then ingredients were even more telling of one's place in the world. What people cooked was not a matter of choice, but of circumstance, dictated by seasons, soil, and social status. For most, meals were simple, repetitive, and unadorned. For a lucky few, they were rich, varied, and spiced with luxury. To understand how people cooked with almost no tools, we must first step into the marketplaces, fields, and kitchens of medieval Europe, where ingredients defined both survival and society. Imagine walking into a small village market on a chilly morning in the year 1200. The stalls are rough wooden tables, shaded with cloth or reed mats, and the smell is a mingling of earth, smoke, and animals. There are no pyramids of exotic fruits, no brightly packaged goods, no abundant choices. Instead, you see rough loaves of bread made from dark rye flour, baskets of onions, turnips, and leeks, still dusted with soil, and perhaps a small pile of salted fish lying stiff on a board. A cask of ale stands nearby, and from a distance comes the faint aroma of cheese, sharp and pungent. This is the pantry of the medieval world, not shelves stocked with imported goods, but what the land and season could offer. Grains formed the backbone of the medieval diet, especially for peasants. Wheat was preferred but expensive, often reserved for the wealthy or for feast days. Most common folk, ate bread made from rye, barley, or oats, dense, dark, and coarse. These grains were also boiled into porridge or pottage, forming thick, filling stews that could sustain laborers through long days in the fields. Grain was not just food, it was survival, as essential as the air they breathed. A poor harvest meant hunger, and a failed harvest could mean famine. Vegetables, too, played a central role, though they were far less varied than today. Onions, leeks, and garlic were staples, easy to grow and flavorful enough to transform otherwise bland meals. Cabbage, turnips, parsnips, and beans filled gardens and fields, hardy crops that could endure the soil and climate. Carrots existed, but were often purple, yellow, or white, rather than the bright orange we know today. Peas and lentils were valued not only for their sustenance, but for their ability to be dried and stored, a crucial factor in surviving harsh winters. Together, these humble vegetables created the base of the peasant diet, simple, repetitive, but nourishing. Meat was far less common than modern imaginations often suppose. For peasants it was rare, often eaten only on special occasions, or as scraps left from larger animals. When meat did appear in the pot, it was often salted pork, fatty and tough, or small animals such as rabbits, chickens, or pigeons. Hunting was largely forbidden for common folk, reserved as a privilege of the nobility, so wild game like deer or boar was beyond reach for most. Fish, however, played an important role, especially in coastal regions and near rivers. Salted herring, pickled eels, and dried cod became staples, traded across vast distances to provide protein in places where fresh meat was scarce. Dairy products offered another layer of sustenance. Milk was often scarce, as much of it went to feeding calves, but cheese and butter provided longer-lasting nourishment. Cheese ranged from soft and fresh to hard and aged, depending on the region and the skill of the maker. Butter was more common in northern Europe, while olive oil dominated in the Mediterranean, though for most peasants, fat of any kind was precious and rarely wasted. Even the drippings from roasted meat were saved, mixed with grains, or spread onto bread to enrich a meal. Fruits, when they appeared, were tied to the seasons. Apples, pears, cherries, plums, and berries were eaten fresh in summer and autumn, then preserved by drying or turning into ciders and wines for the colder months. In southern lands, figs, grapes, and olives thrived, forming staples of Mediterranean diets. But for most, fruit was a fleeting joy, a sweetness that disappeared when the frost arrived. Honey provided the main source of sugar, gathered carefully from hives, or the wild, and was treasured as both food and medicine. The arrival of imported sugar in later centuries was revolutionary, but in the earlier medieval world, honey remained the golden thread of sweetness. And then there were the ingredients of scarcity, what people turned to when hunger pressed close. Acorns, chestnuts, and other wild nuts could be ground into coarse flour. Weeds and wild greens, such as nettles, sorrel, and dandelions, found their way into soups and broths. Mushrooms, though often mistrusted for their danger, were gathered by those who knew the land well. These foods were never first choices, but they were reminders of human resilience, the will to find nourishment even in the humblest corners of nature. Now contrast this with the tables of the wealthy. In castles and manor houses, ingredients told a story of power and privilege. Fine white bread made from wheat flour, delicate pastries, roasted meats seasoned with spices, and fresh fruits brought in from distant lands, all were markers of status. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, saffron, and cloves were imported at great cost, transforming simple dishes into displays of wealth. Sugar, rare and precious, was shaped into sculptures, or used in sweet confections that few peasants could even imagine tasting. The noble diet was not only richer, but far more varied, pulling from both local abundance and international trade routes that stretched across continents. But even in the wealthiest kitchens, the dependence on the land was absolute. A poor harvest could send ripples of hunger from peasant fields to castle halls. The fragility of food supply was universal, reminding rich and poor alike of nature's power. Yet for the poor, the margin was razor thin, and survival often hinged on stretching grains and vegetables as far as they could go. Seasonality shaped every meal. Winter meant root vegetables, salted meat, dried beans, and stored grains. Spring brought fresh greens and herbs, a burst of flavor after months of bland stews. Summer overflowed with fruits and vegetables, while autumn was the time of harvest, when abundance filled barns, cellars, and storage pits. There was no year-round abundance, no out-of-season produce shipped across oceans. The rhythm of food was the rhythm of the earth, and people lived in step with its cycles. Picture, then, a family meal in the heart of winter. The pot holds a thick pottage of barley and beans, flavored with onions, and perhaps a sliver of salted pork, if fortune allows. A loaf of dark rye bread sits on the side, tough but filling. The children wait eagerly for their share, knowing this stew may stretch across several days. In contrast, imagine the height of summer, when fresh cabbage, peas and carrots fill the pot, and apples are eaten straight from the tree. The difference is stark, a reminder of how profoundly seasons ruled medieval lives. Through all of this, the ingredients tell a story, not of indulgence, but of endurance. Every onion chopped, every grain boiled, every fish salted was an act of survival. The poor made do with what was close at hand, turning scarcity into sustenance. The wealthy turned abundance into spectacle, using rare spices and ingredients to proclaim their status. But at the heart of it all was the same truth. The land gave, the land withheld, and people adapted. The medieval diet was not glamorous, but it was resilient. It was a cuisine born not of choice, but of necessity, shaped by hardship and ingenuity. And in its simplicity lies a certain beauty, a reminder that, for much of human history, nourishment was not about preference, but about survival. Once the ingredients were gathered, whether grains, vegetables, fish, or a rare piece of meat, the next challenge was transformation. How could these humble foods be turned into nourishment with so few tools? The answer lay in fire, the flickering, unpredictable companion that was both friend and danger. Cooking in the Middle Ages was less about recipes and more about mastery of flames, coals, and patience. To cook meant to understand the language of fire, to coax it into life, and to harness its heat without the control of stoves or ovens. Imagine again the peasant hearth. It is nothing more than a circle of stones, or a shallow pit lined with clay, the fire burning low at its center. Smoke rises slowly into the air, filling the room until it escapes through the roof hole or cracks in the walls. The pot hangs above, swaying slightly as it catches the draft. Sometimes it rests directly in the embers, blackened with soot. The entire act of cooking is shaped by this living flame, which can never be fully tamed. Too much wood, and the pot boils over. Too little, and the food sits cold and raw. There is no dial to turn, no oven door to close, only intuition passed down from mother to daughter, father to son. Fire gave many options, but each required skill. A pot could be hung high over the flames, to simmer slowly, or lowered close for a fierce boil. Bread could be baked by burying dough in the ashes, or by placing it inside a clay oven heated with wood, where the hot walls held the warmth long after the flames died. Flatbreads were pressed against heated stones, while meat could be roasted on a spit, turned steadily by hand to avoid burning. Even simple foods demanded constant attention, for there was no such thing as setting it and forgetting it. Clay ovens, where they existed, were marvels of simplicity. They were dome-shaped structures of earth or brick, heated by burning wood within, until the interior glowed with heat. Once the embers were swept out, bread or pies could be placed inside, baking slowly in the trapped warmth. For most peasants, such ovens were not private luxuries, but communal resources. Villages might gather once a week to bake bread together, each family waiting its turn, the air thick with the mingled scent of rye and smoke. For families without ovens, baking took different forms. Some doughs were cooked directly on stones heated in the fire, others were wrapped in leaves and buried in embers. The results were rough and rustic, but they were bread nonetheless, the food that sustained life. This ingenuity reflects the essence of medieval cooking, where tools were lacking, creativity filled the gap. Roasting was another ancient art, most often reserved for those who had meat to spare. A spit, nothing more than a sharpened piece of wood or iron, was placed across the fire, and the meat was skewered and turned. In noble halls, great spits were manned by servants, or even by specially designed turn-spit dogs, who ran inside small wheels to rotate the meat steadily. For peasants, roasting was simpler: a rabbit, chicken, or small bird skewered and cooked until its fat dripped into the flames, sending up a fragrant smoke that filled the hut. That sizzling aroma, the sound of fat meeting fire, was a luxury, for roasted meat was a rare treat. Stewing and boiling, however, were the true staples of medieval fire cookery. The cauldron, heavy and soot-blackened, rarely left the hearth. Into it went grains, beans, onions, and whatever scraps were available. Cooking in water softened tough foods, stretched ingredients further, and ensured nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled until they released their last essence, enriching broths that could last for days. Each simmering pot was a living thing, its flavor changing constantly as new additions were made. The line between one meal and the next blurred, for the pot was rarely emptied entirely. This endless stew was the rhythm of peasant life, simple, yet sustaining. Cooking directly in the ashes was another common method. Potatoes had not yet reached Europe, but root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and onions could be buried in the embers, roasted in their own skins until tender. Chestnuts, too, were cooked this way, their shells blackened, their insides sweet. Ash cooking left a distinctive flavor, smoky, earthy, primal, that was familiar to medieval palates. Even with such simple methods, the fire demanded respect. It consumed vast amounts of wood, requiring constant gathering. It filled homes with smoke, stinging eyes and lungs. It scorched food in an instant if neglected. And yet, it was also a place of warmth, of light, of community. Families gathered around the fire, not only to eat, but to share stories, sing songs, and endure the long hours of winter. The act of cooking was inseparable from the act of living. Contrast this with the kitchens of the wealthy. In castles and manors, cooking over fire became an organized art. Massive hearths, sometimes large enough to walk into, dominated the kitchen halls. Multiple spits turned side by side, roasting whole animals. Large cauldrons boiled with stews, sauces, and mulled wines. Bakers tended ovens, where fine white loaves and pastries rose golden. The fire was still unpredictable, still smoky, but here it was wielded with abundance. Teams of servants tended each dish, each flame, ensuring that the feast was worthy of noble pride. Yet whether in a hut or a castle, fire was universal. It was the one tool shared by all, the thread that connected every meal across class and region. The peasant family simmering barley in a single pot, and the noble kitchen roasting venison both relied on the same ancient force. Fire leveled all, even as it revealed the chasm between abundance and scarcity. The mastery of fire also carried symbolic weight. To control flames was to hold power against the darkness and the cold. To lose fire was to risk hunger and death. Many traditions surrounded the hearth: rituals of keeping embers alive, customs of lighting new fires at certain festivals, beliefs that spirits dwelled near the flames. Fire was never just a tool, it was sacred, woven into both survival and myth. Picture one last scene. A mother rises before dawn, the air icy in her cottage. She kneels by the hearth, stirring the ashes gently to uncover the faint glow of last night's embers. With dry kindling, she coaxes the flame back to life, patient and steady, until the fire catches and warmth spreads through the room. Soon water simmers in the cauldron, grain is poured in, and the day's first meal begins. Outside the world is silent, but within the heart of the home beats again. Cooking in the Middle Ages was not a matter of precision or speed. It was an art of patience, of instinct, of living in rhythm with flame and smoke. The hearth was both kitchen and altar, both necessity and symbol. From the poorest peasant to the wealthiest lord, all who ate were united by its fire, and in that fire lay the true magic of medieval cooking, the transformation of the simplest ingredients into life itself. In the medieval world, bread was more than food, it was the foundation of life, the anchor of every meal, and a measure of a family's fortune. Whether coarse and dark or fine and pale, bread shaped daily existence, dictated labor, and reflected status. It was nourishment in its simplest form, and a symbol of both survival and community. Without bread, a family's day was incomplete. Without it, famine loomed closer. To understand the Middle Ages, one must understand bread, the humble, ever-present sustenance that held the centuries together. Picture a small village at dawn, Smoke rises from the chimneys of a dozen cottages, carrying the faint aroma of baking bread. Within a peasant hut, the fire still glows from last night, and a clay or iron pot rests nearby. Today, the family will bake bread, not just for this meal, but for the days ahead. Their flour is coarse, likely a mixture of rye, barley, or oats, ground at the Lord's mill, and often charged with a fee. Wheat flour is rare, expensive, and reserved for nobility or for festivals. The dough is dense, heavy, and sticky in their hands. It is kneaded slowly, sometimes with the addition of water, a pinch of salt, or a touch of sourdough starter, kept alive for months. Every fold, every press, every shaping is both ritual and labor, a careful act of survival. Bread was not only food, but utensil. Trencher bread, thick slices of stale loaf, served as plates, absorbing the juices from stews and broths. After the meal, the trencher itself might be eaten, particularly by the children, or given to animals outside the hut. Bread was economy, in edible form. It carried the weight of nourishment, and the burden of scarcity at the same time. Every crumb mattered, and waste was almost unthinkable. A dropped slice was retrieved, even if cold and hard, because in the Middle Ages, nothing edible was ever wasted. The contrast between peasant bread and noble bread was stark. A lord's table might feature white wheat loaves, soft, aromatic, and carefully shaped. These loaves were often enriched with eggs, butter, or honey, providing texture and flavor far beyond the simple peasant staple. The wealthy had access to mills that ground fine flour and ovens that maintained steady heat, creating bread that was as much a statement of status as a source of food. In noble halls, bread was sometimes sculpted into decorative shapes, marked with the family crest, or baked into festive breads for holidays. For peasants, bread was practical, rough, dense, and sustaining, but still treasured. Communal ovens were vital in many villages. Few peasants could afford to build and maintain their own ovens, so baking became a social event. Families gathered at a shared oven, once or twice a week, waiting for their dough to rise and be baked in the residual heat. This shared ritual bound communities together, a reminder that survival was collective, not solitary. The smell of hundreds of loaves baking at once would fill the air, a mingling of grains, yeast, and smoke, creating an olfactory signature of daily life. Children watched eagerly as loaves were pulled from the oven, still warm and crusted with soot, and learned from their parents how to handle the fragile bread without breaking it. The process of making bread itself was intimate. Grain had to be ground, usually by hand, or with the help of a village mill. Sifting and kneading followed, often on a wooden board, dusted with flour, or a clean piece of cloth. The dough required time to rest, to rise, a process dependent on the ambient warmth of the room, or the residual heat of the fire. Every stage demanded patience and care. A poorly kneaded loaf could collapse or burn, a misjudged oven temperature could leave the center raw, and too little flour could result in a sticky, unworkable mess. Yet with each successful loaf, the family gained nourishment, security, and pride. Bread was also tied to the rhythms of the year. During harvest, abundance allowed for more generous baking, richer loaves, and a sense of satisfaction as grain was transformed into sustenance. In the dead of winter, flour might be rationed, and loaves stretched thin to feed the family over several days. Bread was a constant, a companion, and sometimes the only consistent food in a world where vegetables, meat, and dairy were seasonal or scarce. Its presence marked stability, its absence marked crisis. Religious and social significance, intertwined with the practical. Bread had spiritual weight as well, central to Christian rituals, including the Eucharist. To eat bread was to partake in life, faith, and community. Festivals, holy days, and even funerals featured bread in symbolic forms, connecting daily sustenance to higher meaning. For peasants and nobles alike, bread carried messages of devotion, tradition, and belonging. The tactile nature of bread making also forged familial and generational bonds. Children learned early to knead, shape, and judge the quality of dough. Mothers passed down starter cultures, techniques, and rhythms. Fathers instructed on the proper handling of ovens, the care of fire, and the timing necessary to bake successfully. Bread was education, memory and culture in edible form, embedding lessons of patience, resourcefulness, and care into everyday life. The cooking itself demanded attention to the fire. Too hot, and the crust blackened while the inside remained raw. Too cold, and the loaf would never rise properly, leaving it dense and unpalatable. The temperature could only be judged by intuition, experience, or trial and error. Every loaf was an act of negotiation between human skill and natural forces. In this sense, bread represented more than survival. It was the visible proof of human ingenuity, the tangible outcome of labor, intelligence, and care. Even in times of scarcity, bread provided continuity. During famines, families relied on coarser mixtures, sometimes supplementing flour with crushed acorns or dried roots. These loaves were far from pleasant, but they were edible. They carried families through the harshest seasons, teaching lessons in endurance and resilience. In this way, bread was both a literal and symbolic sustainer of life. Think of the aroma of a loaf freshly pulled from the oven, still warm, its crust rough but fragrant, releasing steam that carries into every corner of a small hut. Imagine hands breaking the bread, revealing the dense, spongy interior, and passing pieces to hungry children. The texture, the smell, the warmth, these were small comforts in a world of scarcity, reminders that life could endure even with almost no tools. Every bite reinforced the intimate connection between sustenance, labor, and survival. Contrast this with the rich feasts of castles, where bread was ornamental, sliced precisely, sometimes sweetened or flavored. Even here, however, bread remained central. It was always a foundation for other foods, a carrier of sauces and gravies, and a constant presence at every meal. No feast was complete without bread, regardless of the abundance surrounding it. Bread was also deeply communal. Bakeries, ovens, and markets brought people together, creating networks of dependence and exchange. Flour, yeast, and wood were shared, bought or borrowed, intertwining economic, social, and practical life. In a world with so few tools and limited resources, the act of bread making itself was a glue that held families and villages together. In essence, bread was the axis around which medieval life turned. It was survival, ritual, community, and culture, all in one. From the peasant's coarse rye to the noble's pale wheat, it nourished bodies and souls alike. Its simplicity belied its importance, its ubiquity reinforced its necessity. To live in the Middle Ages was to live with bread as a constant companion, and to understand medieval life was to understand the labor, skill, and devotion hidden in every loaf. In the quiet of a medieval night, the scent of freshly baked bread would mingle with the smoke of the hearth, filling the home with warmth, comfort, and a sense of order in a harsh world. The bread carried families through famine and feast alike, linking generations, shaping communities, and offering a small daily miracle of sustenance. And so, when we think of the food that truly held the Middle Ages together, it is always bread, humble yet indispensable, simple yet profound, a symbol of endurance, ingenuity, and life itself. In the medieval kitchen, few dishes were as central, versatile, and essential as stews and pottages. These one-pot meals were more than food, they were survival, community, and comfort in a world where tools and resources were scarce. Every household relied on them, whether peasant or noble, and every simmering pot told a story of endurance, ingenuity, and adaptation. To understand medieval cooking is to understand the art and rhythm of the simmering pot. Picture a small peasant kitchen. The hearth glows with embers, and above it hangs a single iron pot, blackened from years of use. Into it goes the day's gathering, a handful of grains, perhaps some beans, a few root vegetables, and whatever scraps of meat or fish the family could afford or forage. Water is poured in, and the pot is placed carefully over the fire. It begins to bubble slowly, releasing a fragrant steam that mingles with the smoky aroma of burning wood. The cooking is slow, patient, almost meditative, requiring constant attention to maintain the right balance between simmer and boil. The term pottage encompasses a range of dishes, thick or thin, simple or enriched. It was a flexible preparation. For peasants, it was often a stew of barley, or oats with onions, leeks, cabbage, or turnips. Salted pork or smoked fish might be added if available. The pot simmered for hours, sometimes days, gradually softening hard ingredients and melding flavors. Bones were included for richness, and even the water used to soak grains became part of the nourishment. Every ingredient mattered, every addition was deliberate, and nothing went to waste. Stews served many purposes beyond sustenance. They stretched limited ingredients to feed larger families, turning a small amount of meat into a hearty meal. They allowed preservation of grains and vegetables for longer periods, and the heat of the cooking process helped kill bacteria and parasites that could otherwise make food unsafe. In a world without refrigeration or modern sanitation, the humble stew was both a practical necessity and a quiet miracle of survival. The act of stirring, tending, and sampling the pot was part ritual, part science. Cooking over an open flame required intuition. Too much heat could burn the contents, too little could leave grains raw. Timing was imprecise, measured by observation rather than clocks. A seasoned cook learned to judge by the sound of bubbles, the smell of aromas, and the texture of ingredients. These skills were passed down from generation to generation, ensuring that families could reliably produce nourishing meals, even in lean times. Contrast this with noble kitchens, where potages and stews took on a different dimension. Large cauldrons, sometimes suspended over multiple fires, allowed cooks to prepare elaborate combinations of meats, spices, and vegetables. Herbs and imported seasonings enhanced flavors, creating dishes that were both practical and luxurious. Nobles could afford the constant attention of kitchen staff, ensuring that nothing burned, and every stew was rich and flavorful. Even so, the underlying principle remained the same. Long cooking transformed humble ingredients into sustenance, melding textures and flavors in a way that satisfied both hunger and palate. Legumes were a cornerstone of these dishes. Beans, lentils, and peas were inexpensive, long-lasting, and nutritious, providing protein and fiber that could sustain hard laborers. They were combined with grains and vegetables to create filling, balanced meals. In some regions, wild greens such as nettles, sorrel, or dandelion leaves were added, providing vitamins and variety. Mushrooms, if identified correctly, offered another source of flavor and nutrition. Each addition reflected the ingenuity of cooks, working with whatever the land offered. The versatility of the pot also allowed adaptation to circumstances. A peasant family might start a pot of pottage with grains and vegetables in the morning, returning later to add a few scraps of meat, herbs, or broth. Leftovers were reheated and eaten again, often over several days. The flavors deepened with time, creating complexity from the simplest of beginnings. In a sense, every stew was a living dish, evolving with each addition, each stir, each passing hour. Salt and herbs played an outsized role in enhancing flavor. Salt was precious and often rationed, so it was used sparingly to preserve and season. Herbs, gathered fresh or dried, added aroma and depth. Common herbs included parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, though availability varied by region. For those who could not afford imported spices, these local herbs were essential, turning simple grains and vegetables into something more palatable and even comforting. The communal aspect of potages cannot be overstated. In villages, families often shared ingredients, cooking over communal fires when possible. Meals became a collective experience, fostering bonds and sharing the burden of labor. The rhythm of stirring, tending, and eating together reinforced social cohesion, a quiet thread of connection in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Even during lean years, stews were a lifeline. When crops failed, or meat was scarce, potages were enriched with whatever could be found: wild roots, foraged greens, small game, or even nuts. The flexibility of the dish allowed creativity in scarcity. Hunger forced adaptation, and the simmering pot was the place where resourcefulness and resilience converged. Stews also carried symbolic and spiritual significance. Bread might accompany the meal, but the pot itself represented sustenance, continuity, and the household's ability to survive. In some traditions, certain days called for fasting or meatless potages, underscoring the connection between food, faith, and daily life. The act of tending a pot was simultaneously practical, ceremonial, and deeply human, a rhythm of life that mirrored the cycles of work, rest, and community. The sensory world of the simmering pot was immersive. Steam curled into the air, carrying earthy aromas of grains, pungent vegetables, and smoky firewood. The bubbling sound was a constant companion, a reassurance that nourishment was underway. Hands and faces were marked with soot and flour, evidence of labor, but also of care. Every spoonful tasted of diligence, patience, and the subtle alchemy that only fire, water, and time could produce. Imagine a family around their modest hearth. The children lean forward eagerly, inhaling the fragrance of barley, beans, and herbs. The mother stirs carefully, adjusting the heat by moving the pot higher or lower above the embers. The father breaks off pieces of bread to dip into the stew, teaching the children how to stretch a small meal into something filling. Even in scarcity, the meal satisfies more than hunger. It nourishes identity, community, and the rhythm of daily life. Across social classes, the pot defined the kitchen. Whether simple or grand, it was the medium through which food was transformed, through which labor became sustenance. The same principles applied in noble halls, though the scale and ingredients differed. The methods were universal: long cooking over controlled heat, careful observation, and gradual melding of flavors. Fire and water, vessel and ingredient combined to create meals that sustained bodies and shaped cultures. The enduring lesson of medieval stews and pottages is this: scarcity does not prevent ingenuity. Even with almost no tools, cooks created dishes that filled, comforted, and connected people. Every pot tells a story of adaptation and resilience, of hands and flames working together to transform raw ingredients into life itself. In the rhythm of stirring and simmering lies the essence of medieval cooking: slow, deliberate, patient, and profoundly human. Cooking in the Middle Ages was inseparable from fire, not just for preparing meals, but for preserving them. In a world without refrigeration, without airtight containers, and with tools scarce, smoke, salt, and careful heat were the guardians of sustenance. Families had to plan ahead, thinking not only of today's meal, but of tomorrow's survival. Understanding fire and smoke was both art and necessity, a daily negotiation with elements that could nourish or destroy. Imagine a peasant household in late autumn. The harvest has been gathered, and the cold winds signal the coming of winter. Meat is precious, and if it is to last through months of scarcity, it must be preserved. A small pig, recently butchered, will provide sustenance for weeks, but only if handled correctly. The family hangs cuts of pork over a smoky fire, or lays them in a low smoking pit in the hearth. The heat is gentle, the smoke continuous, the aroma thick and penetrating. This slow curing is as much ritual as process, demanding constant vigilance and patience. Smoking was a transformative technique. It dried the meat, drove away moisture that caused spoilage, and infused flavor that is at once earthy, intense, and unmistakable. The smoke came from hardwoods, oak, beech, or fruit trees, each adding a subtle variation. Too much fire, and the meat charred; too little, and it failed to cure. Cooks learned to judge the right distance, the right duration, and the right wood. Smoke became both shield and seasoning, a method that extended the life of the family's most valuable proteins. Fish was preserved in similar ways. Salted herring, cod, and eels were packed carefully in barrels, layered with coarse salt to extract moisture and inhibit spoilage. Some fish were smoked over low fires, others dried in the open air, strung on racks where the wind could flow through. Salt was a precious commodity, and using it judiciously was critical. A barrel of well-salted herring could feed a family for weeks, providing protein when fresh meat was unavailable. Salt, smoke, and sun were the allies of survival, turning fragile foods into reliable sustenance. Grains and legumes were no less in need of preservation. Barley, rye, oats, beans, and peas had to be stored carefully to prevent dampness, mold, and vermin. Large sacks were often suspended from rafters, away from the floor and out of reach of mice. The cold winter winds and dry summer air helped keep them stable, but attention was constant. Any sign of spoilage could threaten weeks or months of meals. The medieval cook's attention to detail extended beyond taste and technique to the very science of storage and longevity. Bread, too, required foresight. Loaves were baked in large quantities, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, with the harder stale pieces saved for dipping or secondary meals. Hardtack-like bread could last for weeks, if kept dry and cool. Even this required skill. The bread had to be baked fully enough to resist mold, yet remain edible. Preservation was woven into the daily rhythm, a subtle but constant concern that shaped not only cooking, but life itself. Smoke and fire were also used for flavoring vegetables and dairy. Smoked cheeses, for example, were a staple in many northern regions. Butter could be lightly smoked or boiled to increase its shelf life, and vegetables could be lightly roasted in embers to enhance sweetness while extending usability. Preservation and taste were intertwined. What sustained life could also delight the senses, a reminder that even in scarcity, there was room for ingenuity and pleasure. Preservation was not only practical, but communal. Villages often shared smokehouses, communal drying racks, or large hearths, where meats and fish could cure safely. Cooperation was essential. One household could not always manage all the food alone. Knowledge was shared: which woods provided the best smoke, how to prepare meat cuts for maximum longevity, and how to prevent mold in stored grains. The household was both a culinary and a logistical unit, and preservation was the invisible thread that bound daily labor to survival. Salt, smoke, and fire also shaped medieval social hierarchies. Access to large amounts of salt or dedicated smokehouses was limited, often to those with means or communal standing. Peasant families made do with small quantities, preserving only what they could, while wealthier households could afford entire rooms dedicated to curing hams, hanging sausages, and aging cheeses. Yet all relied on the same principles. Drying, salting, and smoking were universal, ancient techniques that transcended wealth, connecting peasants and nobles through the fundamental act of survival. Even herbs and spices were preserved using similar methods. Fresh herbs were dried over fires, tied in bundles, or crushed into powders to extend their usefulness. Spices imported from faraway lands were carefully measured, stored in small containers, and used sparingly to maximize effect. Preservation was therefore a lesson in economy and anticipation. Every resource was finite, every action deliberate, and the cook's skill lay as much in safeguarding ingredients as in transforming them. Consider a winter scene. The family gathers around a small smoky hearth, the air thick with the scent of cured meat and burning wood. Potatoes do not yet exist in Europe, but turnips, parsnips, and cabbage simmer in a pot, and a loaf of coarse rye sits nearby. Bits of preserved meat, softened by soaking or slow cooking, are added, enriching the flavor and sustenance of the meal. The children learn to appreciate the taste and the process, understanding that what is now available comes from careful preparation, weeks, months, even seasons earlier. Every bite carries the wisdom of preservation. The connection between fire, smoke, and preservation also shaped cultural rituals. Certain festivals, like Michaelmas or St. Martin's Day, involved slaughtering animals and preserving meat for the long winter. The act was communal, ceremonial, and deeply practical. Families, neighbors, and entire villages participated, ensuring that each household had enough to endure the coming months. These rituals tied culinary practices to community cohesion, creating rhythms of life that were both temporal and social. Even in noble kitchens, preservation mattered. Large estates maintained extensive larders, smokehouses, and cellars, storing hams, sausages, salted fish, and cheeses. The principles were identical, though scale and luxury differed. Cooks ensured that meat and dairy would last for weeks or months, blending practicality with culinary sophistication. Fire and smoke were tools of survival, yes, but they were also instruments of flavor, creating the rich, intense tastes that distinguished noble fare. The skill of medieval preservation underscores a larger truth: scarcity breeds ingenuity. With almost no modern tools, people turned to the simplest forces of nature, fire, smoke, salt, and air, to protect their food. These practices demanded constant attention, patience, and knowledge, yet they allowed life to continue through harsh winters, poor harvests, and long journeys. The cook's role extended beyond the immediate meal. They were custodians of survival, guardians of nourishment, and masters of elemental transformation. In essence, fire and smoke were partners in the dance of survival. They transformed raw ingredients into edible, lasting meals. They imparted flavor, enriched textures, and created bonds between generations through shared knowledge. Preservation was a quiet art, invisible in its subtlety, yet vital in its necessity. Without it, families would face famine and hardship. With it, life endured. Picture the household again. The hearth glows low, the air scented with smoke and cured meat. The family sits nearby, sharing a simple stew enriched with preserved vegetables and meats. Hands are warm from stirring, faces are bright with anticipation, and the rhythm of life continues. Outside, the winter wind blows, but inside, fire and smoke safeguard survival, linking the immediate meal to the careful work of weeks and months past. This mastery of fire, smoke, and preservation was an art honed over centuries, a subtle but profound testament to human resilience. Even with almost no tools, medieval cooks learned to extend the life of their ingredients, ensuring sustenance and survival through skill, patience, and knowledge. The simmering smoky pot was more than food, it was hope, security, and ingenuity manifested in the simplest yet most essential forms. Even in a world of scarcity, medieval cooks sought more than mere sustenance. They pursued flavor, aroma, and subtle pleasure. Herbs and spices were the tools of this culinary alchemy, transforming humble ingredients into meals that were aromatic, memorable, and culturally significant. In the peasant kitchen, the range was modest but vital. Parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary, and wild greens added nuance to pottages, stews, and roasted vegetables. Each plant carried its own character, its own whisper of the natural world, and each was used with intention. Imagine a small cottage at dawn. The cook steps outside, her hands brushing over bundles of herbs drying on the windowsill or hanging from the rafters. The air is crisp and fragrant, infused with the scents of rosemary, thyme, and savory. Some herbs were plucked fresh from the garden, others foraged from nearby woods or meadows. Nettles, dandelion leaves, wild onions, and marjoram contributed both nutrition and subtle flavor. The act of gathering herbs was a quiet ritual, connecting cook and land, instilling a rhythm of care and attentiveness. Fresh herbs were chopped, bruised, or crushed to release their essence, then added to simmering pots or sprinkled over roasted vegetables. The heat of the hearth drew out oils and aromas, transforming simple ingredients into something rich and satisfying. Even small additions could elevate the meal: a pinch of thyme in barley porridge, a sprig of parsley in root vegetable stew, or crushed sage leaves in meat broth. These touches reflected not only taste, but intuition, an intimate understanding of what each dish needed to balance flavor, texture, and aroma. Dried herbs extended this subtle alchemy into the winter months. Bundles were carefully hung in smoke-filled kitchens, where the warmth of the hearth prevented rot while gently drying leaves and flowers. The flavor of dried herbs was concentrated, less fresh, but more enduring. A handful added to a pot months after harvest could brighten a thick pottage, infuse a broth with character, or make otherwise plain ingredients remarkable. Preservation and flavor were inseparable. The cook's foresight in drying herbs ensured that even the leanest months retained moments of pleasure. Spices, by contrast, were rare, expensive, and almost magical. Imported from distant lands, they were symbols of status, wealth, and sophistication. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron carried not only flavor, but the weight of long journeys across deserts, seas, and mountains. Their presence transformed a dish, elevating it beyond the ordinary. In noble kitchens, cooks measured spices with precision, blending sweet and savory, pungent and delicate, creating layers of taste that were both surprising and harmonious. A pinch of saffron could turn a simple rice or grain dish golden and aromatic. A few cloves could enhance the flavor of roasted meats or rich stews. For peasants, spices were largely inaccessible, but the principle of enhancement remained. Local herbs, foraged greens, wild flowers, and even acorns or chestnuts contributed texture, aroma, and depth. Cooking was about coaxing the maximum richness from available ingredients. Simmering a few roots, herbs and grains over fire, could yield complexity that felt luxurious despite modest means. The art of flavor did not require wealth, it required observation, patience, and creativity. Salt, too, was a subtle yet transformative element. Beyond preservation, it amplified flavors, balanced bitterness, and enhanced sweetness. In the peasant kitchen, it was used sparingly, carefully measured to stretch supplies. In noble kitchens, salt could be abundant, yet even there its careful use reflected a deep understanding of taste. Without salt, the richness of a meat stew, the sweetness of roasted vegetables, or the freshness of a herb-enhanced broth would be muted. Its role was quiet but vital, a silent partner in the alchemy of flavor. The combination of herbs, spices and salt reflects a universal principle: transformation through subtlety. Medieval cooks understood that flavor was cumulative and layered. Fresh herbs provided immediate aroma, dried herbs contributed lasting character, spices offered novelty and prestige, and salt harmonized all elements. Meals became stories, each bite revealing a narrative of labor, knowledge, and intentionality. The cook was not simply feeding the body, but engaging the senses and imagination. Preparation was also key. Some herbs were added early, simmering for hours to release depth. Others were sprinkled at the end, preserving their brightness and aroma. Timing required experience, intuition, and attention. Too early, and delicate leaves lost their character. Too late, and the dish lacked cohesion. In this way, cooking became a dance with time and temperature, flavor emerging through careful guidance rather than force. Medicinal and symbolic qualities of herbs also informed their use. Rosemary was associated with remembrance, thyme with courage, sage with health. These associations gave meals layers of meaning beyond taste, blending nutrition, symbolism, and tradition. To stir rosemary into a broth was both practical and ritual, connecting cook, family, and cultural belief. Every addition was deliberate, a quiet act of intention imbued with purpose. Herbs and spices also provided contrast, a theme central to medieval cooking: the bitter against the sweet, the pungent against the mild, the sharp against the earthy. These contrasts created engagement in every bite. Even the simplest peasant stew could surprise the palate, each flavor distinct yet harmonious. The cook, with almost no tools, orchestrated a subtle symphony of taste, demonstrating mastery over ingredients and technique. The preparation of herbs and spices demanded patience and care. Leaves were washed, stems removed, and finely chopped or ground. Seeds were toasted or crushed to release oils. Spices were stored in small wooden or ceramic containers, away from heat and moisture, to preserve potency. Each step, meticulous and deliberate, contributed to the ultimate goal: a meal that nourished, delighted, and lingered in memory. Imagine a winter evening, the hearth glows low, the family gathered around the fire, a pot simmers, releasing fragrant steam. Thyme and sage mingle with softened root vegetables, the aroma wrapping the room in warmth. Even the children, who cannot yet discern subtle flavors, inhale the rich, earthy scent. The meal is simple but satisfying, elevated by careful attention to aroma and taste. This quiet ritual is a testament to human ingenuity, how limited resources, patience and knowledge can transform ordinary ingredients into something extraordinary. In noble households, the interplay of herbs and spices reached theatrical heights. Kitchens employed teams of cooks, each responsible for specific flavors or techniques. Dishes were layered with multiple herbs, each spice selected for its effect, each herb timed for release. Meals were feasts of color, scent and flavor, orchestrated to impress both the palate and the eye. Yet the underlying principle remained universal: flavor is achieved through balance, timing and understanding of ingredients. Even when tools were rudimentary, the medieval cook's attention to flavor was profound. Mortar and pestle, knives, wooden spoons and fires were all that was required to unlock the essence of herbs and spices. The act of cooking became a quiet art, a meditation, a dialogue with nature. Each meal reflected observation, experience and intuition, revealing the intelligence embedded in daily life. Ultimately, herbs and spices were more than culinary additives. They represented human creativity in the face of scarcity, the ability to transform necessity into pleasure, and the continuity of culture across generations. They connected peasant kitchens to noble halls, local gardens to distant trade routes, and practical sustenance to symbolic meaning. In the rhythm of chopping, grinding, sprinkling, and simmering, medieval cooks exercised subtle mastery over flavor, creating meals that were nourishing, comforting, and memorable. The simmering pot, enriched by herbs and spices, became a vessel not just of food but of connection to family, to tradition, to the natural world. The act of flavoring was an intimate meditation, a demonstration that even with almost no tools, human ingenuity could elevate life's simplest pleasures. Each meal was a testament to the quiet artistry of medieval cooks, an enduring legacy of skill, patience, and taste. In the Middle Ages, the difference between daily sustenance and a feast could not have been more pronounced. For peasants, the day's meal was simple, repetitive, and practical: coarse bread, a bowl of pottage, a few salted vegetables, perhaps a bit of preserved meat. Every bite was measured, every morsel valued. For nobles, feasts were grand performances designed to display wealth, power, and refinement. Tables groaned with meats, pastries, sauces, and imported spices, creating a spectacle of abundance that stood in sharp contrast to the modest kitchens of the majority. This dichotomy reveals more than social hierarchy. It tells the story of human ingenuity, adaptation, and the meaning we attach to food. Picture a peasant family in their modest cottage. The hearth glows dimly, the pot simmers quietly, and a loaf of dark rye bread rests nearby. The children lean forward, hungry but patient, learning to stretch every bite. Each meal is framed by necessity, shaped by scarcity, and yet suffused with small rituals: the dipping of bread into broth, the careful distribution of preserved vegetables, the subtle satisfaction of a hot meal in cold months. This is food as survival, as education, as continuity. Now imagine a noble hall, decorated with tapestries, candles, and flowers. The table is long, polished, and laden with dishes that dazzle the senses: roasted swans, peacock, spiced hams, pies bursting with meats and fruits, and delicate pastries glazed with honey. Servants move swiftly, pouring wine, replacing platters, and ensuring that every guest experiences the feast as theatre. Musicians play softly in the background, and the aroma of roasted meats mingles with the scent of herbs, spices, and burning torches. The meal is not only sustenance but ceremony, performance, and affirmation of status. The contrasts extend beyond ingredients to preparation and tools. Peasant meals rely on one pot, one fire, and minimal utensils. Cooking is intimate, labor-intensive, and repetitive, but it fosters skill, patience, and understanding of natural rhythms. Noble kitchens employ teams of cooks, each with specialized knowledge: roasting, baking, sauce-making, spicing, and presentation. Ovens, cauldrons, and elaborate kitchen equipment enable complex dishes that would be impossible for a peasant family to produce. The difference in resources does not diminish the artistry of either, but it frames it differently, one as survival, the other as spectacle. Yet beneath these contrasts, common threads emerge. Both peasants and nobles understood the value of bread, the necessity of preservation, and the transformative power of fire, herbs, and spices. Even a grand feast begins with the same principles as a humble pottage: careful selection of ingredients, controlled cooking, and attention to flavor and timing. The techniques differ in scale and complexity, but the underlying understanding of food, labor, and survival connects every table. Feasts were also events of social cohesion. Nobles celebrated alliances, victories, marriages, and festivals through lavish meals. The table became a stage for diplomacy, for negotiation, and for displaying generosity. Guests were seated strategically, dishes were served with choreography, and conversations unfolded under the backdrop of shared food. Meals were thus a language, communicating wealth, power, and cultural knowledge. Every detail, from the choice of spices to the color of sauces, was laden with meaning, a subtle narrative, told through taste and spectacle. For peasants, communal meals had a different rhythm. Village gatherings, Harvest celebrations, or religious festivals, allowed families to share resources, exchange stories, and reinforce bonds. While simpler than noble feasts, these occasions were no less meaningful. The communal preparation of large pottages, the sharing of bread, and the distribution of preserved meats created a sense of interdependence and connection. Food, whether humble or extravagant, was always a medium of human engagement, culture, and memory. Contrast also extended to perception and expectation. Peasants measured satisfaction through fullness and nutrition, finding contentment in warm, sustaining meals that fed body and spirit. Nobles experienced a broader sensory engagement. Variety of texture, aroma, color, and flavor created a narrative across the course of the meal. Sweet sauces followed savory roasts, spiced meats were paired with fruits, and wines cleansed the palate between dishes. Every bite was part of a carefully crafted sequence, a story told through taste. The rhythm of daily meals versus feasts also reflects time and labor. Peasant cooking followed a steady cadence dictated by seasons, crop cycles, and daylight. Meals were simple, functional, and repeated daily, creating continuity and stability. Feasts, by contrast, were punctuated events, requiring days of preparation, procurement of rare ingredients, and orchestration of servants. The anticipation of a feast heightened its impact, making it memorable, dramatic, and emotionally resonant. Yet even in abundance, scarcity remained a subtle force. Noble kitchens faced limits in storage, preservation, and timing. Meats had to be consumed quickly, pastries carefully baked, and spices rationed to maintain their potency. The grandeur of a feast depended on meticulous planning, foresight, and coordination. In this sense, both peasant and noble cooks engaged with scarcity, adapting techniques to their respective contexts, and maximizing what was available. The sensory experience of a feast contrasts vividly with the calm intimacy of daily meals. Imagine the smells: smoke, roasting meat, baked bread, and fresh herbs wafting through a noble hall, versus the gentle aroma of a simmering pottage and a fire-warmed hut. Consider the textures: tender meats, layered pastries, and spiced sauces on one side, coarse grains and softened roots on the other. Taste and perception were shaped not only by ingredients, but by context, expectation, and the surrounding ritual. Despite these contrasts, there is a profound continuity in medieval culinary philosophy. Both daily meals and feasts reflect mastery over natural elements: fire, water, salt, and air. Both demonstrate the use of preservation, seasoning, and timing to transform raw ingredients into sustenance and pleasure. Both embody cultural values, whether modesty, survival, celebration, or status. The contrasts highlight social differences, yet the similarities reveal a shared humanity, a universal engagement with food as nourishment, culture, and art. Feasts also taught lessons to the observers and participants. Young nobles learned etiquette, culinary appreciation, and the significance of seasonality and presentation. Children in peasant homes learned patience, careful rationing, and the transformative power of a single pot. In both settings, cooking and eating were educational, shaping perception, identity, and relationship with the environment. Food was never merely sustenance, it was training in skill, resourcefulness, and appreciation. Consider a harvest festival in a village: the long table, laden with communal dishes, pottages, preserved meats, bread, and seasonal vegetables. The children watch as elders carve meats, measure grains, and add herbs, learning the skills and wisdom embedded in each gesture. Compare this to a noble banquet, where courtiers observe the careful pouring of wine, the serving of spiced pies, and the orchestration of multiple dishes, absorbing etiquette, taste, and social nuance. In both cases, food is a teacher, connecting past and future through practice, observation, and shared experience. Ultimately, the contrast between feasts and daily meals is not merely about wealth or luxury, it is about intention, scale, and perception. Both reveal the central role of food in human life, culture, and memory. Both require mastery over fire, timing, preservation, and flavor. Both reflect the interplay between scarcity and abundance, survival and indulgence, necessity and pleasure. The medieval table, whether humble or grand, was a stage upon which life's challenges, ingenuity, and delights were enacted. Even today, these contrasts remind us of the enduring lessons of the Middle Ages, that resourcefulness and patience shape our sustenance, that flavor, aroma, and presentation enrich not only the palate, but the spirit, and that every meal, no matter how modest, carries the imprint of skill, culture, and care. Daily meals grounded life in continuity, while feasts elevated it into memory, spectacle, and connection. Both were indispensable threads in the fabric of medieval existence. In quiet reflection, one can imagine a humble hearth and a grand hall side by side, each alive with fire, aroma, and purpose. In one, a family quietly shares bread and pottage. In the other, a noble table celebrates abundance with roasted meats and spiced delicacies. The contrasts are striking, yet both are tied by the same fundamental truths: the mastery of elements, the attention to flavor, and the deep human need to nurture and be nurtured. In the Middle Ages, cooking was an exercise in creativity, patience, and resourcefulness. Kitchens were rarely equipped with the variety of tools we take for granted today. There were no stoves, ovens with precise temperature control, blenders, or refrigeration. Instead, cooks relied on a handful of essential implements: iron pots, wooden spoons, clay bowls, knives, mortars, and pestles. Every action required careful thought, every technique adapted to the limitations of the environment. The scarcity of tools did not hinder skill, rather it fostered a remarkable ingenuity, transforming simplicity into culinary mastery. Picture a peasant kitchen. A single hearth dominates the small space, the floor blackened by smoke and soot. Above the fire, an iron pot hangs from a simple hook or tripod. This one pot serves many purposes: boiling, simmering, roasting in embers, or even fermenting grains into a basic ale. The cook must constantly adjust the height above the flames to control temperature, a delicate balance achieved by experience rather than measurement. There is no thermometer, only intuition, observation, and the steady rhythm of daily practice guide the hand. Wooden utensils were indispensable. Spoons, spatulas, and stirring rods were carved from locally available trees, shaped to fit the hand and withstand heat. They were used to mix pottages, lift vegetables from boiling water, or scrape grains from the bottom of the pot. Over time, these tools developed character, darkened from smoke, slightly warped from heat, but entirely reliable. Even the simplest wooden spoon was a finely tuned instrument, a mediator between cook, ingredients, and fire. Knives were another cornerstone. Every household needed at least one good knife, used for chopping vegetables, slicing meat, or cutting bread. Iron blades were precious and required regular sharpening, often on whetstones to maintain functionality. The shape, weight, and balance of a knife influenced every cut and slice. Even a single blade could serve multiple purposes, demanding dexterity, control, and attention. The cook's hands became extensions of the tools themselves, performing tasks with subtlety that compensated for the lack of mechanical aids. Mortars and pestles were key for transforming herbs, seeds, and spices into usable forms. Fresh leaves were crushed to release essential oils, seeds ground to enhance flavor, and dried herbs pulverized for storage. The rhythmic pounding and grinding was as much meditation as preparation, a tactile connection to the ingredients and their essence. In noble kitchens, multiple mortars might exist for different purposes, while peasant households relied on a single device, yet both demonstrated the universal importance of these humble tools. Clay and ceramic bowls, often hand-thrown, were used for mixing, storing, and serving. Their shapes varied by region, reflecting local materials and traditions, yet all were robust enough to handle hot liquids, coarse grains, and repeated use. Bowls might be placed near the fire to warm contents gently, or covered with leaves to protect food from pests. Even these simple vessels demanded careful handling and thoughtful placement, their limitations shaping the rhythm and method of cooking. The hearth itself was a multifunctional tool, more than just a source of heat. Its design, central to a room in peasant homes, more elaborate in noble halls, allowed for boiling, roasting, baking in embers, and drying herbs. Adjustable hooks, tripods, and clay ovens permitted temperature control within the limits of observation. The cook learned to judge when flames were too high, when embers were ready for roasting, and when coals provided gentle heat for slow simmering. Mastery of fire was the core skill that made all other tools effective. Even implements we might now consider mundane required ingenuity. Strings or ropes were used to suspend meats for smoking or drying. Wooden racks allowed grains or vegetables to air dry. Stones or bricks served as makeshift trivets to regulate heat or elevate pots above flames. Every item in the kitchen had multiple uses, often improvised, demonstrating the adaptive intelligence of medieval cooks. Scarcity of equipment did not impede creativity, it demanded it. Knots, hooks, and levers became vital components of the cooking environment. Suspended pots could be raised or lowered to control heat. Weights balanced improvised presses for extracting oils or juices. These simple mechanisms amplified the cook's ability to manage food without complex machinery. Every movement required awareness, careful timing, and coordination with the natural elements of fire, water, and air. The kitchen became a dynamic space, a stage for continual problem-solving and quiet ingenuity. Bread making demonstrated the clever use of minimal tools. Loaves were shaped by hand, kneaded on wooden boards or even flat stones, and baked in clay ovens heated by embers. Timing and touch were crucial. Too much flour, and the loaf became dense. Too little heat, and it remained raw inside. The baker relied on senses rather than instruments, learning the subtle signs that indicated readiness. This tactile relationship with ingredients extended to every aspect of cooking, from stirring potages to roasting roots, creating a profound connection between cook, food, and method. Peasant cooks also innovated with storage and preservation, using limited equipment. Earthenware jars stored grains, salted meats, and liquids. Covered with leaves or cloth, these containers extended shelf life and protected food from pests. Smokehouses, even rudimentary ones, allowed preservation of meats, and simple racks enabled drying of herbs and vegetables. Ingenuity lay in optimizing what was available, maximizing function from basic materials, and protecting precious sustenance through careful management. Noble kitchens, by contrast, expanded on these same principles at a grander scale. Copper pots, multiple ovens, and specialized utensils allowed complex dishes with precise preparation. Rotisseries, spits, and large cauldrons enabled simultaneous cooking of multiple dishes. Yet even in these settings, the underlying principles mirrored those of peasant kitchens: careful control of heat, observation of ingredients, and skillful use of limited tools to achieve a desired result. The difference was scale, not concept. Improvisation was a daily necessity. When a hook broke, a branch could replace it. When a wooden spoon splintered, a new one could be carved. When fuel ran low, embers from yesterday's fire were conserved and carefully reignited. Every limitation demanded adaptation, teaching the cook resilience, creativity, and patience. In this way, medieval kitchens became classrooms of problem-solving, where ingenuity was as essential as flour or meat. The most striking aspect of medieval cooking, with minimal tools, is the quiet elegance of its mastery. Simplicity did not equate to mediocrity. On the contrary, skillful use of few implements demanded attentiveness, knowledge, and dexterity. A single pot could yield multiple meals. A single knife could perform countless tasks. The cook's intelligence and experience transformed raw materials into nourishing, flavorful dishes, proving that human ingenuity could overcome scarcity with elegance and precision. Imagine a peasant cook at dusk. The hearth glows, low embers crackling softly. A pot simmers, a wooden spoon stirs slowly, and a mortar rests nearby with freshly crushed herbs. Bread rises gently in a nearby clay dish, while preserved meats hang in the smoky air. Every tool is in use, every movement purposeful. The simplicity of the kitchen belies the complexity of skill, intuition, and experience required to feed a family consistently and well. Here, almost no equipment meets maximum human ingenuity. In essence, medieval kitchens reveal a profound truth: limitations foster creativity. The absence of modern conveniences demanded observation, patience, and resourcefulness. Fire, wood, iron, clay, and hands were all that was needed to transform raw ingredients into sustenance and flavor. Every tool, no matter how humble, carried significance, shaping method, timing and outcome. Ingenuity became as essential as food itself, and mastery lay in understanding the delicate dance between ingredients, heat, and minimal equipment. In the medieval world, food had to move with people, as well as remain at home. Farmers tending fields, merchants traveling between towns, and soldiers marching across kingdoms all faced the challenge of sustaining themselves far from the hearth. Without refrigeration, modern packaging, or ready-made meals, medieval people relied on resourcefulness, preservation, and portability. What was cooked at home needed to be durable, compact, and versatile. Every bite had to nourish, sustain energy, and endure the elements, making adaptability as vital as flavor. Consider a peasant laborer rising before dawn to work in the fields. His breakfast is simple yet sustaining: coarse bread, perhaps a small portion of cheese or salted meat, and a few dried fruits, if available. The meal is prepared to last until midday, providing calories without spoilage. Each component is chosen deliberately: bread for energy, preserved meat for protein, and fruit for a hint of sweetness and essential vitamins. Even in modest circumstances, the cook ensures the meal is functional, nourishing, and portable. For travelers, meals had to endure long distances. Merchants and pilgrims carried dried or salted foods that would survive days without refrigeration. Hardtack, a dense dry bread, was a staple, durable, lightweight, and long-lasting. Salted meats, smoked fish, dried fruits, and nuts complemented it, creating a balanced, energy-rich diet suitable for walking, riding, or rowing. A small pouch of these items could sustain a person through days of travel, each bite a careful balance of sustenance and practicality. Soldiers facing the rigors of campaigns relied heavily on portable provisions. Armies on the move required food that could survive heat, moisture, and the unpredictability of battle. Salted pork, dried beef, hard bread, and legumes were common staples. Cooked meals were a luxury. Often soldiers ate what could be carried, rationed, or foraged. Efficiency and durability were paramount. Each item was chosen for its capacity to nourish without spoiling, providing both physical energy and psychological reassurance during grueling marches. Adaptability also meant ingenuity in preparation. Peasants and soldiers alike learned to improvise cooking methods in the field. Open fires, heated stones, and small cauldrons allowed boiling, roasting, or stewing, even in temporary camps. Foraging supplemented supplies. Wild greens, herbs, and roots added flavor, nutrition, and variety. Every meal was a combination of careful planning and opportunistic adaptation, a testament to human resourcefulness under constraint. Preservation remained central to mobility. Salted and smoked foods dominated because they could survive travel and time without spoiling. Salt drew out moisture, inhibiting bacteria. Smoke added flavor and extended shelf life. Foods were often wrapped in leaves, stored in wooden containers, or suspended from belts or saddles. The cook or traveling soldier understood that improper handling could render provisions useless, creating the need for constant attention and careful storage. Even in the harshest conditions, flavor and familiarity mattered. Soldiers carried small amounts of herbs, dried onions, or wild garlic to add taste to otherwise bland provisions. Peasants traveling to markets or fairs might bring a small jar of honey or a handful of dried berries. These small touches maintained morale, reminding travelers of home and comfort. Sustenance alone was insufficient. The psychological aspect of eating, the aroma, texture, and taste was crucial for endurance and well-being. The portability of food shaped the daily rhythm of travelers. Meals were often small, consumed in brief pauses during marches or labor. Eating required efficiency. Hard bread was broken into chunks, dried meats chewed slowly, and water rationed carefully. Timing was strategic, ensuring energy was available for work or travel while minimizing spoilage. Travelers became adept at reading the landscape, weather, and available resources, adjusting their intake and preparation to optimize sustenance. Seasonality also dictated what could be carried. In autumn, dried fruits, salted meats, and preserved vegetables were abundant, providing essential supplies for winter journeys. Spring and summer offered fresh vegetables and fruits, often consumed immediately, or lightly preserved for short-term travel. Soldiers adapted their provisions to the campaign season. Winter campaigns relied on preserved foods, while summer allowed for fresher but less durable items. Awareness of seasons, combined with knowledge of preservation, made mobility feasible. The ingenuity of medieval food extends to improvisation in unexpected circumstances. A soldier or traveler could boil legumes over a campfire, soak dried bread in water or broth, or roast nuts and grains found along the path. Leftover portions from previous meals could be repurposed. Stale bread became porridge, dried meat was added to vegetable stews, and herbs foraged from the roadside enhanced flavor. Every meal was a lesson in efficiency, adaptability, and creativity, turning scarcity into opportunity. Travelers and soldiers also relied on communal preparation. Camps, inns, and market towns often became hubs, where food could be exchanged, supplemented, or cooked collectively. Knowledge of local resources, such as edible plants, fresh water, or nearby livestock, allowed people to extend limited provisions. Sharing methods, ingredients, and techniques fostered community, even among strangers, reinforcing the social dimension of sustenance in motion. Noble travel, while more comfortable, followed similar principles. Estates and courts moved with retainers, cooks, and portable kitchens. Meals were planned in advance, provisions carefully packed, and spices preserved for flavor. Roast meats could be prepared over mobile hearths, and preserved breads and pastries ensured continuity. Even in luxury, the underlying logic of preservation, adaptability, and careful management guided every decision, reflecting continuity with simpler peasant practices. The psychological impact of portable meals cannot be understated. Knowing that sustenance was reliable, even in unfamiliar or hostile environments, provided comfort and stability. A soldier carrying salted meat, or a merchant with dried bread, could face uncertainty with greater confidence. Meals became a source of reassurance, a tangible connection to home, culture, and routine. The act of eating, even in motion, anchored people in a world otherwise shaped by uncertainty and risk. Imagine a winter march. Snow crunches underfoot, the cold air stings the skin, and soldiers huddle around a small fire. Over the flames, a cauldron simmers with soaked beans and bits of salted pork. Hard bread is broken into chunks and dipped into the stew, and dried herbs scavenged along the roadside add a touch of flavor. Each bite sustains energy, warms the body, and bolsters morale. Even under harsh conditions, the combination of preservation, portability, and flavor ensures survival and resilience. Ultimately, medieval food for work, travel, and soldiers demonstrates human adaptability. Limited tools, minimal equipment, and the challenges of movement demanded creativity, foresight, and resourcefulness. Preservation techniques, improvisation, and careful planning allowed individuals to sustain themselves across fields, roads, and battlefields. Meals became more than sustenance. They were tools of endurance, morale, and human ingenuity. The adaptability required in motion also reinforces a broader lesson. Scarcity does not preclude richness of experience. Even the simplest portable meals carried flavors, aromas, and traditions. Every dried fruit, salted meat, or hardened loaf connected the traveler to home, heritage, and craft. Human intelligence transformed limitations into opportunity, demonstrating that food is not only nourishment, but also resilience, creativity, and cultural continuity. In the medieval world, cooking was not merely a practical act. It was intertwined with ritual, season, and culture. The rhythm of the year dictated what could be eaten, how it was prepared, and the ceremonies surrounding its consumption. Food marked festivals, religious observances, and social milestones, creating a deep connection between sustenance, spirituality, and tradition. Every household, from peasant cottages to noble halls, adhered to seasonal cycles that shaped diet, labor, and celebration, making cooking both an art and a discipline embedded in time. Season dictated everything. In early spring, foraged greens, tender shoots, and newly sprouted herbs appeared first, offering vital nutrition after the long winter. Cooks celebrated the arrival of fresh produce, incorporating dandelions, nettles, and sorrel into potages and salads. These early dishes were simple yet vibrant, their green colors and bright flavors symbolizing renewal, hope, and the resilience of life. The act of gathering and preparing these foods was itself a ritual, connecting humans to the land and the cycles of nature. Summer brought abundance. Gardens yielded herbs, vegetables, and fruits, while fields offered grains, legumes, and wild herbs. Cooks engaged in preservation, drying herbs, salting meats, fermenting vegetables, and storing fruits to sustain the household through leaner months. The summer kitchen was alive with activity. The chopping of vegetables, the grinding of grains, the meticulous layering of flavors. Every step was both practical and ceremonial, a testament to care, foresight, and the human desire to celebrate abundance. Autumn, the season of harvest, was marked by feasts and communal effort. Villagers gathered crops, stored grains, and preserved meats, fruits, and vegetables. Kitchens filled with the aromas of roasted root vegetables, simmering potages, and sweet pastries made from the season's bounty. Each act of preparation was ritualized, from kneading bread to curing hams, reflecting respect for the land and the labor required to sustain life. Autumn was a time of gratitude, reflection, and preparation, a bridge between the lush abundance of summer and the scarcity of winter. Winter demanded resourcefulness. Fresh produce was scarce, and cooks relied on preserved foods, salted meats, dried fruits, smoked fish, root vegetables, stored in cellars, and fermented grains. The kitchen became a sanctuary, the hearth a source of warmth, light, and sustenance. Meals were slower to prepare, often involving simmering pots and long, gentle cooking processes that drew out maximum flavor from minimal ingredients. Winter cooking was ritualistic in its own right, a quiet practice of endurance, preservation, and careful management of limited resources. Religious observances shaped food preparation as well. Lent, fasting days, and other holy periods imposed restrictions on meat, dairy, or indulgent ingredients, requiring creativity and adaptation. Fish, legumes, grains, and vegetables became central, and cooks learned to elevate simple ingredients through skillful preparation. Meals became acts of devotion as well as sustenance, integrating spirituality with daily practice. Even the simplest household acknowledged these rhythms, aligning labor, flavor, and ritual with the spiritual calendar. Cultural traditions influenced not only what was cooked, but also how it was presented and consumed. In noble halls, elaborate banquets followed strict etiquette. Courses were served in sequence, spices and sauces layered for dramatic effect, and garnishes added visual splendor. Each dish was part of a narrative, reflecting hierarchy, diplomacy, and taste. Even modest households observed customs, special meals for saints' days, weddings, or village fairs, demonstrating that ritual and ceremony were embedded in every level of society. The preparation and consumption of food often involved collective participation. In peasant homes, families worked together, children helped gather herbs, adults chopped vegetables or stirred pots, and elders oversaw preservation. In noble households, entire teams of cooks, servants, and apprentices executed complex meals. Rituals ensured efficiency and harmony, teaching skills and reinforcing community bonds. Food became both a practical necessity and a medium for social cohesion, its preparation a shared act of labor, care, and tradition. Herbs and spices were themselves woven into ritual and symbolism. Rosemary, sage, thyme, and marjoram were valued not only for flavor, but for cultural significance, protection, health, courage, and remembrance. Their addition to meals was deliberate, integrating symbolic meaning with taste. Even simple acts, sprinkling sage over roasted vegetables, or adding thyme to a stew, connected the cook and the eater to a broader web of tradition, belief, and cultural memory. Feasts, whether seasonal or ceremonial, were often grander expressions of these traditions. Noble banquets featured multiple courses, elaborate spicing, and artistic presentation, designed to impress guests and celebrate status. Peasant festivals, though simpler, involved communal preparation, sharing, and celebration of seasonal bounty. Both reflected the principle that food is more than sustenance, it is a connector of people, a marker of time, and a vessel for cultural continuity. Even the most mundane daily meals contained echoes of ritual. Bread breaking, pot stirring, and herb sprinkling were performed with attentiveness and care, embedding meaning into routine. The act of cooking was never purely functional, it was a meditation on resources, labor, and community. Timing, temperature, and seasoning were guided by tradition and observation, ensuring that each meal honored both the ingredients and the effort required to produce them. Storage and preservation were themselves ritualized. Smokehouses, cellars, crocks, and jars were managed meticulously, rotated seasonally, and treated with care. Root vegetables were layered in straw, salted meats hung in the smoke-filled kitchen, and herbs dried on rafters. These practices maintained quality, ensured safety, and preserved continuity across seasons. Preservation was not merely technical, it was ritual, a deliberate interaction with nature and time. The cyclical nature of the medieval calendar reinforced these connections. Spring brought renewal, summer abundance, autumn harvest, and winter preservation. Festivals and religious observances punctuated these cycles, giving rhythm to labor, leisure, and communal life. Cooking, therefore, was inseparable from the broader patterns of living. It marked time, connected people, and shaped culture. Every pot, hearth, and tool was an instrument of both survival and ritual, bridging the mundane and the ceremonial. Ultimately, medieval cooking rituals reveal the profound relationship between humans, nature, and society. They show that food is more than sustenance, it is a medium for tradition, education, and cultural expression. Through seasonal cycles, religious observances, and communal practices, cooks embedded meaning into each action, creating a rhythm that guided life from dawn to dusk, and season to season. Even with almost no tools, the cook engaged in a dialogue with ingredients, fire, and community, crafting meals that were nourishing, symbolic, and timeless. Imagine a winter evening, the hearth glows, a pot simmers with preserved vegetables and herbs, and the family gathers quietly. Each step of preparation, from chopping root vegetables to stirring the pottage, is deliberate and ritualized, connecting the present moment with months of preparation and generations of knowledge. In these acts, cooking transcends necessity, becoming meditation, tradition, and celebration. The medieval kitchen, humble or grand, was a stage where life, culture, and nature converged in aroma, flavor, and ritual. In the Middle Ages, geography shaped cuisine as decisively as social class or available tools. Mountains, rivers, forests, and coastlines dictated the ingredients at hand, while local culture and climate influenced preparation and flavor. Every region developed its own culinary identity, born from necessity, environment, and creativity. From the salt-rich coasts to fertile river valleys, from northern highlands to southern plains, local specialties emerged, giving each community a distinct palate and tradition. These regional differences enriched medieval food culture, offering variety, innovation, and the pleasure of place. In coastal regions, fish dominated the diet. Herring, cod, and mackerel were salted, smoked, or dried to preserve them for travel or lean times. Fresh fish appeared seasonally, often in the early morning markets, its flavor enhanced by herbs, vinegar, and sometimes honey. Coastal peasants and fishermen developed techniques that maximized taste while respecting limited equipment. Open fires for roasting, clay ovens for baking, and smoke for preservation. Each recipe was functional yet elegant, reflecting a deep understanding of local resources. Inland river valleys offered an abundance of freshwater fish, vegetables, and grains. Pottages, thickened with barley or oats, became staples, enriched with herbs, wild greens, and occasionally eggs or meat. Cooks adapted recipes to seasonal availability. Tender spring vegetables gave way to autumn roots, while berries and fruits added bursts of color and flavor in summer. The river provided fish, irrigation supported crops, and fertile soil ensured sustenance, an ecosystem shaping not only survival, but culinary identity. Mountainous regions demanded ingenuity in the face of scarcity. Steep terrain and harsher climates limited crop diversity, favoring hardy grains, preserved meats, and wild foraged foods. Soups and stews became central, combining grains, herbs, and whatever proteins were available. Preservation techniques, smoking, salting, drying, were essential to survive long winters. The cook's skill lay in extracting maximum flavor and nutrition from minimal ingredients, turning necessity into culinary artistry. Even with almost no tools, these kitchens produced meals that were hearty, sustaining, and uniquely local. In the south, warmer climates and fertile plains encouraged cultivation of fruits, legumes, and vegetables that northern regions could not grow. Olives, onions, beans, and seasonal fruits appeared in abundance, often spiced with herbs and imported seasonings like cinnamon, cloves, or pepper. Noble kitchens in these regions showcased elaborate dishes, pies filled with meats and fruits, pastries glazed with honey, and spiced sauces that contrasted sweet and savory. These regional flavors reflected both environment and trade, combining local abundance with global influence. Trade routes further diversified regional cuisines. Spices, sugar, citrus fruits, and exotic ingredients reached inland kitchens, infusing traditional recipes with novel flavors. Coastal merchants, river traders, and traveling cooks acted as conduits of culinary innovation, introducing subtle but profound changes to local dishes. A pie in one region might feature locally grown apples, while in another, imported raisins or sugar transformed its taste. Ingredients once rare became symbols of status and sophistication, and their integration into local specialties reflected both curiosity and prestige. Every local specialty tells a story of adaptation. In northern regions, root vegetables were roasted over embers or incorporated into thick, nourishing stews. In the lowlands, freshwater fish stews simmered alongside grains, creating hearty, sustaining meals. In hilly or forested areas, wild game and preserved meats shaped diets, while herbs foraged along paths added both flavor and subtle medicinal qualities. Each dish represents a conversation between people and place, a negotiation with available resources, and an exercise in culinary creativity. Even within a single region, villages and households developed signature techniques and flavors. One village might prefer coarse rye bread with a bitter nutty undertone, while a neighboring settlement favors softer, milder loaves. Sauces and seasonings varied by family and tradition. One household might add a touch of vinegar, another a handful of savory herbs. These micro-variations, passed down through generations, created a living tapestry of taste, each meal a link between past and present, home and land. Local specialties often intersected with ritual and celebration. Festivals, marriages, and religious observances highlighted distinctive dishes, emphasizing flavor, symbolism, and abundance. Coastal communities might celebrate with fresh fish or preserved seafood, river valleys with grain-based potages, mountain hamlets with roasted game, and southern plains with spiced pies. These traditions reinforced identity, memory, and belonging, transforming food into a medium of cultural storytelling. The simplicity of tools did not prevent complexity of flavor. A coastal fisherman's smoked herring required careful timing over embers, understanding smoke density, and subtle seasoning to avoid overpowering the fish. A mountain peasant's stew involved layering grains, herbs, and preserved meats to achieve balance, texture, and nourishment. Even noble kitchens, with more resources, relied on fundamental principles, controlling heat, balancing flavors, and sequencing preparation. Across regions, mastery emerged not from abundance of tools, but from intimate knowledge of ingredients, fire, and method. Contrast between regions became an essential aspect of medieval culinary identity. Northern dishes emphasized preservation, heartiness, and endurance, reflecting harsher climates and longer winters. Southern cuisines celebrated freshness, variety, and richness, taking advantage of milder weather and fertile soils. Inland regions, reliant on rivers and streams, blended grains, vegetables, and freshwater fish to create nuanced, sustaining meals. Coastal diets highlighted seafood and salt, incorporating preservation techniques that allowed mobility and trade. These contrasts reveal the interplay between geography, climate, culture, and human ingenuity. Cultural exchange further shaped regional flavors. Traveling merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers carried recipes and ingredients across borders, introducing new ideas and methods. A spice once exclusive to distant lands could become a local accent, transforming familiar dishes. Techniques migrated as well, roasting over embers, fermenting grains, and layering flavors were shared, adapted, and integrated into local practices. This exchange enriched medieval cuisine, creating diversity and subtle fusion while maintaining regional distinctiveness. Regional specialties also reflect economic realities. Communities adapted to available resources, maximizing nutrition and minimizing waste. In coastal regions, surplus fish could be salted and traded inland. Mountain communities relied on preserved grains and meats to survive harsh winters. Noble estates sourced exotic ingredients to display wealth, yet underlying principles, resourcefulness, preservation, and skill, remained universal. Culinary diversity thus emerged from the interaction of environment, necessity, and human ingenuity. Even the most modest meals carried a sense of place. A simple peasant pottage, flavored with local herbs, tells a story of the land, its seasons, and its traditions. A noble pie, glazed with honey and seasoned with imported spices, speaks of trade networks, status, and aspiration. Regional variations were not only practical, they were expressions of identity, memory, and creativity, linking food, people, and landscape in a dynamic narrative of taste. Ultimately, medieval cuisine was a celebration of adaptability, resourcefulness, and the joy of place. Each region, from coast to mountains, plains to rivers, cultivated dishes that reflected climate, culture, and necessity. Simple or elaborate, humble or noble, these local specialties demonstrate a profound human capacity to transform available resources into sustenance, pleasure, and meaning. Food became both survival and story, a sensory chronicle of people, land, and tradition. Imagine traveling through medieval lands, the scent of salted fish drifting from a harbor town, the aroma of roasting root vegetables in a mountain village, the sweetness of spiced pies in southern estates, and the comforting warmth of grain pottages simmering along river valleys. Each taste is a window into place, history, and ingenuity, revealing the intimate connection between humans and their environment. The diversity of regional cuisine demonstrates that even with almost no tools, creativity and care shaped every meal, embedding culture, geography, and emotion into every bite. In the Middle Ages, flavor was as much about skill and knowledge as it was about ingredients. Though many households had limited tools, the medieval cook possessed an extraordinary sensitivity to taste, texture, and aroma. Spices and flavorings, whether local or imported, were used with careful deliberation to transform modest ingredients into memorable meals. A pinch of herbs, a touch of vinegar, or a small amount of imported pepper could elevate a simple dish, revealing the nuanced understanding cooks developed despite their scarcity of equipment. Locally grown herbs formed the backbone of medieval flavor. Parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary, and marjoram were among the most common, each carrying distinct aroma and subtle taste profiles. These herbs were added to soups, stews, roasted vegetables, and even grains to enhance depth, without overpowering the primary ingredients. Fresh herbs were prized for their vitality, while dried herbs, stored in clay jars or hanging in bundles, offered long-term flavor retention. The act of seasoning became an exercise in attentiveness, requiring precise timing and gentle handling. Salt was the most essential seasoning, ubiquitous across regions and social classes. It preserved as much as it flavored, protecting meats, fish, and even bread from spoilage. Yet medieval cooks were sensitive to its application. Too much salt could overwhelm, too little could render a dish bland or unsafe. Mastery of salt was a silent art, balancing preservation, taste and subtlety, and it underpinned nearly every savory dish, quietly shaping the medieval palate. Acidity and sourness played important roles in taste enhancement. Vinegars, wines, and fermented liquids were used to balance richness, tenderize meats, and enliven stews. A few drops of vinegar could awaken the flavors of root vegetables or legumes, while wine might be simmered into a sauce to deepen aroma and complexity. Fermented products, often produced at home or locally sourced, were integral to medieval cooking, subtly altering texture, flavor, and nutritional profile. These ingredients demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of how taste interacts with chemical processes and time. Exotic spices, introduced through trade routes, added dimension and intrigue to the medieval diet. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron were rare and precious, reserved for noble households or special occasions. They were used sparingly, as a little went a long way in transforming familiar dishes into extraordinary experiences. The presence of spices signaled status, wealth, and curiosity, but their integration also required skill, balancing sweetness, heat, and aroma without overpowering the base ingredients. Even the humblest cooks understood layering flavors. A simple pottage might combine local vegetables, salted meats, and fresh herbs, each ingredient added at precise intervals to optimize taste and texture. Hard bread could be softened in broth or wine, infusing subtle flavor. Root vegetables, often bland when cooked alone, became rich and savory when combined with herbs, fats, or smoked meats. This layering was a quiet, meditative practice, requiring patience, attention, and an intimate understanding of ingredients. Fat, both animal and plant-based, was central to taste enhancement. Butter, lard, and oils carried flavor, enriched textures, and facilitated cooking over fire. Drizzling melted fat over roasted vegetables, incorporating it into dough, or using it to sauté grains added both taste and satiety. Cooks balanced fats with acidity, salt, and herbs to create meals that were satisfying and nuanced, demonstrating an instinctive grasp of how flavor components interact. Sweetness, though less common in daily meals, was carefully incorporated to balance other tastes. Honey, fruit syrups, and when available, sugar were used in moderation to create contrast, enhance preservation, or mark ceremonial occasions. Sweet and savory combinations were not merely decorative, they created layered sensory experiences that engaged both palate and mind. A roasted root vegetable, sweetened with honey, or a spiced meat pie, offered subtle complexity that reflected the cook's artistry. The technique of seasoning also relied on timing. Herbs added too early in a long simmer might lose aroma, while those added at the final moment preserve freshness and potency. Spices sprinkled into boiling liquids released aroma gradually, infusing depth without overwhelming delicate flavors. Cooks developed a keen sense of when to introduce each element, transforming every pot into a carefully orchestrated symphony of taste. Even with almost no tools, mastery over timing and sequence allowed dramatic flavor impact. Smokiness and char played an equally important role. Roasting over embers or using a smokehouse imparted warmth, depth, and subtle complexity to meats, grains, and even vegetables. The cook learned to control intensity. Lightly smoked fish versus deeply charred root vegetables offered contrast and variety. Smoke, like spices, became an instrument for storytelling, its aroma signaling place, season, or technique, while linking sensory experience to memory and identity. Accompanying techniques, such as grinding, crushing, or pounding, also enhanced flavor. Mortars and pestles allowed herbs, seeds, and nuts to release essential oils, intensifying aroma and taste. Crushing garlic or mustard released pungent compounds, transforming a bland stew into a vivid dish. Even rudimentary tools became instruments of flavor, extending the cook's ability to manipulate texture, aroma, and intensity with precision. Balance was the ultimate principle. Medieval cooks sought harmony among sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and savory notes, achieving depth, even without modern measurement. A simple broth could carry richness from fat, acidity from vinegar, sweetness from honey, and aromatic herb notes, creating a multi-dimensional flavor profile. Each ingredient played its role, every addition deliberate, and even a single misstep could disturb the delicate equilibrium. The art lay in subtlety, restraint, and intuitive understanding. Cultural context also influenced flavoring. Religious restrictions, regional preferences, and available trade dictated both choice and proportion of spices. Northern regions relied heavily on preserved foods, salted and smoked, often complemented with robust local herbs. Southern regions had access to fresh produce, fruits, and exotic spices, allowing more intricate layering of taste. Across the continent, cooks adapted to local realities, creating distinct culinary identities, while demonstrating universal principles of flavor manipulation. Even without modern utensils, flavor could be refined through technique. Stirring slowly, simmering gently, layering ingredients at precise intervals, and carefully managing heat allowed maximum extraction of taste. Cooks understood how textures and aromas evolved over time, and how minor adjustments could produce profound results. In this sense, medieval cooking was an art of patience, observation, and sensitivity, a delicate dance with ingredients, fire, and seasonality. Imagine a humble kitchen. A pot simmers over a low fire, rosemary and thyme, releasing aroma, a pinch of salt, and a drop of vinegar, enhancing subtle flavors. A slice of hard bread softens in the broth, absorbing richness and aroma. Smoke curls from a nearby roasting tray, adding depth and warmth. Even with minimal tools, the dish becomes layered, complex, and satisfying, a testament to the medieval cook's ingenuity and understanding of taste. Ultimately, spices and flavoring reveal the profound creativity of medieval cooks. Despite limitations, they mastered subtlety, balance, and depth, transforming simple ingredients into memorable, nourishing meals. Herbs, salts, acids, fats, smoke, and exotic spices became instruments, each carefully deployed to create layers of taste. Even with almost no tools, the art of flavor was fully realized, reflecting intuition, observation, and centuries of accumulated culinary wisdom. In every bite, medieval food tells a story of skill, culture, and sensory delight. In the Middle Ages, sweets were a rare and cherished indulgence, reserved for special occasions, feasts, or the tables of the wealthy. Sugar, spices, and exotic fruits were costly and imported, often arriving from distant lands through elaborate trade routes. Honey, more accessible than sugar, provided natural sweetness to everyday dishes, while dried fruits, such as figs, dates, and raisins, added both flavor and substance. Even in the simplest household, the presence of sweetness was a symbol of celebration, pleasure, and care, transforming ordinary meals into moments of delight. The preparation of sweets required patience, precision, and ingenuity. Without modern stoves or ovens, cooks relied on open fires, clay hearths, and heated stones. Honey might be gently warmed and combined with ground nuts to create a sticky, flavorful paste. Dried fruits could be simmered slowly in spiced water, producing a syrupy compote to accompany bread, pastries, or porridges. Even modest kitchens found ways to introduce sweetness into daily life, celebrating flavor despite scarcity of tools or ingredients. In noble households, desserts could be elaborate and dramatic. Tarts, pies, and custards were infused with imported spices, such as cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and sometimes a hint of saffron, offering both aroma and exoticism. Dried fruits, preserved nuts, and sugar elevated these creations, marking feasts as extraordinary events. The layering of flavors, sweet, tart, spiced, and nutty, demonstrated both technical skill and artistic sensibility. These desserts were more than food, they were expressions of status, creativity, and celebration, turning meals into sensory performances. Honey remained the most common sweetener across social classes. Its versatility allowed for a range of preparations, drizzled over bread, mixed into porridge, or blended with herbs and nuts for festive confections. Mead, a fermented honey beverage, was another form of indulgence, consumed during celebrations or as a comforting treat in winter months. Honey's availability and relative durability made it a cornerstone of medieval sweetness. Its golden color and floral aroma, imbuing both taste and ritual significance. Dried fruits played an essential role in medieval desserts. Figs, dates, prunes, and raisins were preserved for months, often imported from southern regions or brought via trade networks. They added concentrated flavor, natural sweetness, and texture, complementing grains, nuts, and honey. A small portion of dried fruit could transform a humble porridge into a rich, satisfying dish, or elevate a bread pudding into a festive treat. These ingredients demonstrated how preservation and resourcefulness combined with taste to create culinary delight. Nuts were another key component in sweet preparation. Almonds, hazelnuts, and walnuts were chopped, ground, or blended into pastes to add richness, texture, and subtle flavor. Combined with honey or fruits, they created layered sweets that were simultaneously nourishing and indulgent. Even a modest, nut-enhanced porridge or cake provided a sense of luxury and care, reflecting the medieval appreciation for texture, flavor, and balanced indulgence. Spices played a subtle but transformative role in sweets. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and sometimes ginger-infused pastries, tarts, and puddings, with warmth and complexity. These imported ingredients were precious, often reserved for noble kitchens or special occasions. Their careful addition enhanced, rather than overpowered, the primary flavors, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of balance and nuance. Spiced desserts became symbols of refinement, trade, and cultural connection, linking distant lands to the medieval table. Bread itself became a canvas for sweet experimentation. Enriched with honey, fruits, and nuts, it transcended basic sustenance, becoming a celebratory offering or gift. Pies and pastries combined layers of dough with spiced fillings, occasionally glazed with syrup or honey, to create visual and sensory appeal. Even with limited tools, the medieval cook transformed simple flour and water into edible artistry, showcasing skill, creativity, and the subtle luxury of sweetness. Custards and creams, while rare, offered another dimension of indulgence. Made with eggs, milk, and sometimes sugar or honey, they required careful attention to heat and timing. Stirred slowly over gentle flames, they thickened into smooth, delicate textures that contrasted with rustic breads or dense pastries. These preparations demanded precision, patience, and sensitivity, reflecting the medieval cook's capacity to balance flavor, texture, and consistency, even with minimal equipment. Seasonality influenced sweet creation as much as it did savory cooking. Fresh fruits appeared in summer and early autumn, offering vibrant color, natural sweetness, and moisture. Apples, pears, cherries, and berries could be baked, stewed, or combined with nuts and honey to create simple but satisfying desserts. Preservation of fruits through drying or cooking extended their availability into winter, ensuring that sweetness remained part of the diet year-round, even when fresh ingredients were scarce. Even modest households found ways to celebrate sweet flavors. Honey cakes, nut-studded breads, and fruit compotes provided pleasure without requiring imported spices or sugar. The act of preparing these desserts was itself a ritual. Chopping, mixing, simmering, and baking created sensory richness that nourished both body and spirit. The subtle indulgence of sweetness, carefully integrated into daily or festive meals, demonstrated the medieval understanding that flavor, texture, and care were inseparable from nourishment. Desserts also served social and symbolic purposes. Wedding cakes, festival treats, and ceremonial sweets reinforced communal bonds and cultural identity. Sharing honeyed bread, spiced pastries, or nut-filled tarts conveyed generosity, hospitality, and celebration. Even in the humblest settings, sweetness became a medium for storytelling, ritual, and expression, linking individual experience with collective tradition. The interplay between scarcity and indulgence heightened the emotional impact of sweets. When sugar or exotic spices were rare, even a small portion became extraordinary, eliciting anticipation, delight, and memory. Medieval cooks understood this subtle psychology. The act of sweetening was not merely taste, but a statement of care, attention, and respect. A shared dessert could transform a meal into an event, bridging everyday life with pleasure, ritual, and imagination. Technique was crucial to successful sweet preparation. Heating, stirring, and layering ingredients required attentiveness and timing. Overcooked honey could darken or harden. Too rapid heating of milk and eggs could curdle custards. Even without modern thermometers, medieval cooks developed an intuitive sense of heat, texture, and transformation. Mastery lay in observation, patience, and responsiveness, creating desserts that were both precise and magical. Imagine a noble feast, a honeyed almond tart, glistening on a wooden board, spiced with cinnamon and cloves, steam rising gently in the flickering torchlight. Nearby, a simple fruit compote simmers, releasing the aroma of cooked apples and dried figs. Even in a modest household, a small bowl of honeyed porridge or nut-studded bread provides warmth, comfort, and delight. Each sweet, whether simple or elaborate, tells a story of resourcefulness, taste, and celebration, proving that indulgence need not rely on abundance but on care, skill, and imagination. Ultimately, medieval desserts and sweets reveal the subtle artistry of taste under constraint. Limited tools, scarce ingredients, and long preservation challenges demanded creativity, precision, and patience. Honey, dried fruits, nuts and spices were employed with sensitivity, transforming humble or rare ingredients into moments of pleasure. Even with almost no tools, medieval cooks mastered the balance of flavor, texture, and aroma, crafting sweets that nourished, celebrated, and delighted, a testament to ingenuity, culture, and the enduring human desire for beauty and taste.